Welcome to the History Maps podcast. So, picture a mountain that is so rich with silver ore that it, single-handedly funds a global empire. But it's also so toxic and deadly that the people who are forced to mine it actually call it the mountain that eats men.
Yeah, we are talking about Cerro Rico in Potosi, which is in present-day Bolivia. And, it really was the economic engine of a system that changed the entire globe.
Right, and that is our focus today. We are taking a deep dive into the Spanish colonization of the Americas, and this is part of our History of the Americas series. And, if you have ever worked in a sprawling corporate hierarchy where the regional office is constantly battling the head office, well, you will probably recognize a lot of the structural friction we are about to discuss.
Oh, absolutely.
Because we are going to unpack how this transoceanic empire actually functioned, like on a mechanical day-to-day level.
Yeah, and to really understand the mechanics of this sweeping expansion, you have to look at the psychological, religious, and political state of the Iberian Peninsula right at the moment it begins. The context of late 1492 is just essential here.
Because we tend to view imperial history as this clean, top-down series of deliberate state-sponsored chess moves, right?
Yeah, but the reality of Spain at this specific moment was much more volatile than that.
Well, Castile and Aragon weren't just sitting in peacetime looking for a real estate investment or, a new trade route.
No, not at all. They had just concluded centuries of conflict, which is known as the Reconquista. And on January 1st, 1492, that long campaign finally culminated in the fall of the Emirate of Granada.
Which was the last Muslim stronghold on the peninsula.
Right. So the monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, had consolidated their territory through this centuries-long existential struggle.
And let's just pause on that atmosphere for a second. It must have been highly militarized and, frankly, intensely religious. You have a whole generation of people whose entire societal purpose was this religious war.
It was a very militant Catholicism, and it immediately translated into their domestic policy. Ferdinand and Isabella viewed their sovereignty and their religious identity as entirely intertwined. They couldn't separate the two.
Right.
So on March 31st of that same year, they ordered the expulsion of the Jewish population who refused to convert to Christianity. This is known as the Alhambra Decree.
So within, 3 months, they conquer a rival state and expel a huge portion of their own population based purely on religious ideology.
That is the environment.
Yeah.
The atmosphere is one of intense religious fervor, territorial consolidation, and this is key, a large population of newly unemployed soldiers who just spent generations fighting.
Right, they need something to do.
Yeah. And then, on August 3rd, Christopher Columbus departs from Palos de la Frontera. By October 12th, he makes landfall in the Western Hemisphere. The momentum of the Reconquista didn't just stop at the coastline. It really propelled itself right across the Atlantic Ocean.
Which brings us to the Caribbean.
Yes.
Because this becomes the initial testing ground, or like the sandbox for everything the Spanish would attempt on the mainland later on.
It does.
Columbus sets up a settlement called La Navidad on Hispaniola during his first voyage. But then when he returns in 1493, it is completely destroyed.
Well,
So he founds La Isabela. But I want to stop here because the traditional motivation we always hear for these expeditions is gold, glory, God.
right, the classic summary.
Yeah, it sounds like a crusade.
Yeah.
But if we look at the actual mechanics, the business model of these expeditions, it feels very different. Can you break that down? Because reading the sources, Columbus and these early explorers aren't generals in a state army.
No, they really aren't.
They're essentially rogue tech CEOs pitching a highly risky startup to the King of Spain, right?
That is a highly accurate way to frame it. The Crown of Castile didn't have a vast standing army ready to deploy across an ocean, nor did they want to drain their own treasury to fund these explorations.
Too much financial risk.
Well, highly risky. Instead, they relied on private individuals. The key figure here is the Adelantado.
The Adelantado.
Yes, this was the expedition leader. An Adelantado had to possess some material wealth and social standing to approach the crown and secure a royal license, which was known as a capitulation.
So the capitulation is essentially the regulatory approval. It's like saying, give me the patent, I will raise the capital, and you get a cut of the profits.
That is the arrangement. This contract laid out the specific terms, the geographical boundaries of the expedition, and what the crown's cut of the wealth would be. And that was usually a fifth, the royal fifth.
The royal fifth, okay.
And the Adelantado pledged the majority of the capital to fund the ships, the supplies, and the recruitment. But The participants in the expedition were not paid soldiers receiving a regular wage. They were investors staking their lives and their own meager fortunes on the venture.
So how did they divide the profits if there were no wages? Like, how does a guy on the ship get paid?
The spoils of the expedition were divided up in proportion to the initial capital a participant brought to the table.
Oh,
So if you brought your own armor and weapons, you received a certain share. If you brought a horse, you received 2 shares.
wait, 2 shares for a horse?
Yeah, one for yourself and one recognizing the horse as a highly valuable, terrifying machine of war in this new context.
That drastically changes the incentive structure. Every single person on that ship needs an immediate return on investment. They aren't building infrastructure, they are looking for a payout. And initially in the Caribbean, they expected that return to be vast amounts of surface gold and trade spices. But that isn't what they found, is it? They found dense populations of agriculturalists living in decentralized villages, specifically the Taino people.
Right. And when the expected mineral wealth didn't materialize in the quantities the investors demanded, the Spanish pivoted. They began to view the indigenous populations themselves as the primary economic resource.
Just extracting labor.
Yeah, and this led to the implementation of the encomienda system. Under this system, the Crown awarded particular indigenous settlements to individual Spaniards. The Spaniard, the encomendero, was theoretically supposed to protect the indigenous people and instruct them in the Catholic faith.
Okay.
In exchange for that, he was entitled to extract their labor and tribute.
Wait, let me get this straight. The Crown is sitting in Europe passing laws saying, be nice to locals and teach them religion, while simultaneously demanding a high quota of wealth that absolutely requires forced labor.
That is the dynamic.
That seems incredibly hypocritical. How do they justify that cognitive dissonance?
They justified it through legal and theological fictions. The encomienda was framed as a reciprocal relationship, like a paternalistic duty. But on the ground, it was practically indistinguishable from slavery.
Right.
The Spanish put the Taino to work panning for whatever surface gold existed in the rivers or growing food to sustain the Spanish settlements.
And the mechanical reality of pulling people away from their own farms to pan for gold must have ruined the local economy.
Oh, it was catastrophic for the Taino. We see an immediate demographic collapse on Hispaniola. The pre-contact population, which estimates place anywhere from hundreds of thousands to perhaps millions, was practically wiped out by the mid-1490s.
That is a staggering drop in just a few years.
It is, and it was caused by an intersection of factors. You have the brutal overwork demanded by the encomenderos, the introduction of old-world infectious diseases to which the Taino had no immunity, and the severe disruption of their traditional family structures and agricultural cycles.
The agricultural disruption is a crucial point, I think, because if you pull all the working-age adults away to pan for gold, well, no one is planting the cassava or the maize.
Correct. When the indigenous people couldn't tend their own crops because they were forced to work for the Spanish, severe food shortages followed. And this famine ironically threatened the survival of the Spanish settlements that depended entirely on indigenous agriculture to eat.
The indigenous people didn't just sit back and take it either. The sources mention specific resistance leaders.
Yes, indigenous leaders, known as caciques, actively rebelled. Enriquillo on Hispaniola and Hatui, who fought in Hispaniola and later fled to Cuba, are prominent examples of indigenous resistance against the encomienda system.
Hatui is a really interesting figure.
Very much so. Hatui actually traveled to Cuba specifically to warn the indigenous people there about the impending Spanish arrival. He advised them to throw all their gold into the river.
Because he knew what the gold meant to the Spanish.
Right. He recognized that gold was the true god the Spanish worshipped, and as long as the gold was there, the Spanish would bring violence.
So the Caribbean model collapses because the labor force dies out, and the gold just isn't there in high quantities. The venture capitalists in Spain are panicking. Their labor force is dying out. So they start raiding neighboring islands like the Bahamas and Jamaica to capture more indigenous people, and they just replicate this demographic disaster across the entire Caribbean basin.
That is exactly what happens. By the mid-1510s, the resources of the Caribbean were largely exhausted. The Spanish are forced to look toward the mainland.
But before we follow them to Mexico, we need to talk about the internal Spanish reaction to this horror. Because it is easy to view the colonizers as a monolith, but the sources show there was a profound moral crisis happening back in Spain regarding this exploitation.
It is a critical aspect of this history. The Spanish Empire produced some of its own most vocal critics, and the pushback began with the religious orders. Let's put ourselves in the pews for a moment. It is December 1511 on the island of Hispaniola. A Dominican friar named Antonio de Montesinos delivers a searing sermon to a congregation of Spanish elites.
And they are probably just expecting a standard mass, right?
Yes, but instead, Montesinos explicitly denounces their cruelty and abuse. He tells them they are living in mortal sin for their treatment of the indigenous population and that they have no more chance of salvation than a Moor or a Turk.
Wow. I mean, that is a dangerous thing to say to a room full of heavily armed, wealthy men who rely on that exact system for their wealth.
It was highly controversial. But that sermon deeply affected a young encomendero who was present in the congregation, a man named Bartolomé de las Casas.
Las Casas is a fascinating figure in all of this. He hears this sermon, and it eventually prompts him to give up his own encomienda, join the Dominican order, and dedicate his long life to advocating for indigenous rights.
He did. Las Casas became the officially appointed protector of the Indians. He lobbied the crown relentlessly. In 1542, he wrote a text titled A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies.
And that text was pretty graphic, right?
Very. It vividly detailed the atrocities committed by the Spanish, the massacres, the overwork, the cruelties. This document was highly influential within Spain, but ironically, it was quickly weaponized by Spain's European rivals, particularly the English and the Dutch.
Because they wanted their own empires, and this gave them the moral high ground to attack Spain.
Yeah, that is the core of it. They translated Las Casas' own words and printed them with graphic illustrations to fuel what became known as the Black Legend.
The Black Legend.
Right. It was a widespread propaganda campaign depicting the Spanish Empire as uniquely cruel and tyrannical. The English used this narrative to justify their own imperial ambitions, arguing that they were bringing a more civilized Protestant influence to the Americas.
But the Spanish crown did actually attempt to legislate this, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they didn't just ignore the friars completely.
The crown responded with two major pieces of legislation. First, you have the Laws of Burgos, passed between 1512 and 1513. These were the first codified set of laws governing the behavior of Spanish settlers.
What did they actually mandate?
They explicitly forbade the maltreatment of natives, they regulated their working hours and food rations, but they still endorsed their forced resettlement for religious conversion.
So it was a half measure.
Basically. And when those proved completely ineffective on the ground, the crown went further. Spurred heavily by Las Casas, they passed the new laws of 1542.
And the new laws were designed to dismantle the entire business model.
They were. The new laws aimed to severely restrict the encomienda system, specifically preventing the inheritance of encomiendas in perpetuity. When an encomendero died, the indigenous laborers were supposed to revert to the crown rather than passing to the encomendero's children.
Okay, let's unpack this mechanical reality. Because the crown is sitting in Europe, it takes months for a ship to cross the Atlantic. They pass a law saying you cannot pass your highly profitable forced labor force down to your children. How effective could these laws possibly be? I mean, how did the colonizers react to the crown trying to dismantle their entire livelihood from an ocean away?
They reacted with violent insurrection.
Violent insurrection.
Yes, because the crown's primary motivation was twofold. There was a genuine religious concern for their new indigenous vassals, but there was also a political need to prevent a powerful, independent aristocracy of conquistadors from forming in the Americas.
They didn't want rivals.
Right. And the encomenderos saw the new laws as a total betrayal of their contracts and their investments. The pushback was intense. In Peru, the crown sent a newly appointed viceroy, Blasco Núñez Vela, with strict orders to enforce the new laws immediately upon his arrival.
And how did that go for him?
It was fatal. The Spanish conquerors in Peru, led by Gonzalo Pizarro, who was the half-brother of Francisco Pizarro, revolted. They overthrew the viceroy, met him in battle, and killed him in combat in 1546. They literally chopped off the head of the king's direct representative.
That is an astonishing level of defiance. I mean, you don't get much more rebellious than executing the viceroy.
It clearly demonstrates the immense tension between royal authority and the private economic interests of the colonizers. We see a similar situation in Mexico a few years later. Don Martin Cortés, the son and legal heir of Hernán Cortés, led a conspiracy of encomenderos against the crown's attempts to limit their inheritance rights.
Did he succeed?
No, that revolt failed. Don Martin was exiled and other conspirators were executed, but eventually the crown realized they couldn't enforce the new laws without risking the loss of the colonies entirely.
They had to back down.
They had to compromise. They started slowly phasing out the encomienda over generations rather than abolishing it overnight, but the friction definitely remained.
And this tension culminates in something truly unique, the Valladolid debate.
Yes, held between 1550 and 1551 at the Colegio de San Gregorio in the city of Valladolid in Spain. It stands as the first moral debate in European history regarding the rights of colonized people.
It's quite a moment.
It is. It was a formal theological and legal dispute sanctioned by the crown, which actually paused new conquests while the debate took place.
What were the actual arguments? How do you litigate the right to conquer someone else?
So on one side, you had Bartolomé de las Casas. He argued that the indigenous peoples were rational beings with natural rights. He said they were fully capable of governing themselves and peacefully accepting Christianity without the need for military subjugation.
Okay, and on the other side?
On the other side was Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda, a humanist scholar who utilized Aristotelian philosophy. Sepúlveda argued the theory of natural slavery, that certain peoples were inherently predisposed to servitude.
So he was weaponizing ancient philosophy to justify modern conquest?
Yes. He claimed that indigenous practices, such as human sacrifice, justified conquest, and that they required Spanish governance to become civilized.
It is a profound moment, even if the debate didn't end the exploitation on the ground, because it shows an empire pausing to legally and morally audit its own expansion. But while the theologians debated in Spain, the reality on the ground had already shifted dramatically. The Caribbean model was dead. The Spanish needed new markets, which brings us to the mainland. Hernán Cortés leads the campaign in Mexico from 1519 to 1521, and Francisco Pizarro captures the Inca Emperor Atahualpa at Cajamarca in 1532.
And these two conquests fundamentally altered the scale and the economic trajectory of the Spanish Empire.
Because the environment was so different.
Utterly different. In the Caribbean, they found decentralized villages. In central Mexico and the Andes, they encountered dense, hierarchically organized, highly complex urban civilizations with millions of inhabitants.
The traditional narrative often portrays these conquests as a handful of brilliant, technologically superior Europeans sweeping aside vast native armies. But reading the sources, that narrative seems highly flawed.
It is highly flawed.
The mechanics of the conquest feel less about technological superiority, although, sure, steel and horses mattered, and much more about exploiting pre-existing local geopolitical fault lines. To use our corporate analogy again, it's like a smaller, aggressive corporate entity executing a hostile takeover, not by sheer financial power, but by allying with disgruntled major shareholders within the target company to oust the CEO.
That analogy captures the political dynamics perfectly. Let's examine Mexico. The Aztec Empire, centered in the monumental city of Tenochtitlan, was not a homogeneous, fully integrated state in the modern sense.
What was it then?
It was a confederation. It was a system of subjugated city-states forced to pay heavy tribute in goods and sacrificial victims to the Mexican rulers. When Cortés arrived, he recognized this widespread resentment. He didn't defeat the Aztecs alone. He spearheaded a vast indigenous coalition, and the most critical alliance was with the city-state of Tlaxcala.
Now, Tlaxcala was entirely surrounded by the Aztec Empire, but had never been fully conquered, right? Why were they so eager to join Cortés?
The Tlaxcalans were locked in a constant state of warfare known as the Flowery Wars, and they were under a severe economic blockade by the Aztecs. They couldn't even get basic goods like salt or cotton because the Aztecs controlled all the trade routes.
So they were desperate for an out.
Right. When they encountered the Spanish, after initial fierce hostilities, the Tlaxcalan leadership made a calculated geopolitical decision. They chose to ally with these strange newcomers to overthrow their primary enemy. The final assault on Tenochtitlan involved a few hundred Spaniards and tens of thousands of indigenous warriors, primarily Tlaxcalans.
So the Spanish essentially hijacked an existing indigenous rebellion to break a blockade. And did that alliance actually pay off for Tlaxcala?
It did. The Tlaxcalans negotiated enduring political privileges. They received exemptions from tribute, the right to ride horses and carry firearms, and protections for their lands from the Spanish crown that lasted well into the colonial era.
We see an almost identical dynamic play out a decade later in Peru, with Pizarro.
Yes. When Pizarro arrived in the Andes, the Inca Empire, which was an enormous administrative achievement spanning thousands of miles along the coast and mountains, was highly vulnerable.
Why was it vulnerable?
A devastating outbreak of smallpox, which had traveled overland ahead of the Spanish, had killed the Inca emperor Huayna Capac.
So the disease outpaced the physical explorers.
Yes, the biological shockwave hit before the military one. The emperor's death sparked a brutal civil war between two half-brothers, Atahualpa and Huascar, over the succession. The empire was torn apart by this internal conflict. Atahualpa had just emerged victorious when he was ambushed by Pizarro's small force at Cajamarca in 1532.
The ambush at Cajamarca is a wild historical moment. You have a few hundred Spaniards capturing the emperor in front of his entire army. That paralyzes the highly centralized Inca state apparatus.
It paralyzed the leadership, certainly. But just as in Mexico, the ultimate Spanish victory required exploiting local resentments. The Incas had rapidly expanded their empire over the previous century, subjugating numerous diverse groups.
Who were looking for a way out, just like the Tlaxcalans.
Exactly. Nations like the Huanca, the Chachapoyas, and the Cañaris deeply resented Inca domination and heavy taxation. They viewed the Spanish not as conquerors, but as useful allies to help them break free from Inca control. Without these massive indigenous auxiliary forces providing logistical support, intelligence, food, and combat troops, the Spanish conquest of these dense empires would have been impossible.
So central Mexico and the Andes become the densely populated, resource-rich anchors of the Spanish Empire. They overlay their new administration directly on top of the old imperial structures. Mexico City is literally built on the ruins of Tenochtitlan. But what happens when the expeditions push beyond these core zones? What happens when they enter regions that don't have dense populations or obvious mineral wealth? That takes us to the expanding frontiers and the anomalies.
The expansion beyond the core zones really reveals the strict limitations of the Spanish colonial model. Two factors dictated the long-term density and success of Spanish settlement. First, the presence of a large, hierarchically organized indigenous population that could be drafted for labor. Second, the presence of exploitable resources, preferably silver or gold.
And if they didn't find those?
When expeditions entered regions lacking these elements, they struggled, failed, or had to radically adapt their tactics.
Chile is a perfect example of this struggle. Pedro de Valdivia found Santiago in 1541, but he runs into a completely different kind of indigenous resistance than Cortés or Pizarro did.
Very different. In southern Chile, the Spanish encountered the Mapuche people, whom they referred to as Araucanians. Unlike the centralized Aztecs or Incas, the Mapuche lived in decentralized, autonomous communities situated in dense forests.
So no central leader to capture.
Right. There was no single emperor to capture, no central capital to besiege, and no pre-existing system of mass tribute for the Spanish to co-opt. When the Spanish attempted to push south of the Biobío River to establish settlements and encomiendas, the Mapuche resisted fiercely.
They adapted to Spanish tactics, too.
They adapted rapidly. The conflict culminated in the destruction of the 7 cities between 1599 and 1604, where the Mapuche successfully destroyed major Spanish settlements, killed the governor, and forced the empire to retreat entirely from the region south of the river.
They successfully reversed colonization in that region. That is a very rare outcome in this period.
It is. It resulted in the establishment of a hardened, militarized frontier known as La Frontera. Chile remained a fringe area of the empire, requiring constant subsidies, the Situado from the Viceroyalty of Peru, just to maintain the garrison at Concepcion. The Spanish simply could not project power effectively into that terrain against that decentralized defense.
Then we have a truly strange anomaly in Venezuela. The Spanish crown, specifically Charles I, who was also Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, actually outsourced the colonization of Western Venezuela to a German banking family. Wait, so they just handed over colonial rights to a bank? How does that even happen?
It highlights how financially stretched the crown was. Charles was deeply in debt to the Welsers and the Fuggers, which were powerful German banking family.
Why was he in debt to them?
They had financed the massive bribes required to secure his election as Holy Roman Emperor. So, to pay off these immense debts, in 1528 he granted the Welsers the right to colonize and exploit western Venezuela, creating the colony of Klein Venedig, or Little Venice.
What does a colony run by a bank actually look like?
Well, it looks like an exercise in immediate, aggressive resource extraction. The Welsers founded the towns of Coro and Maracaibo, However, their primary motivation was immediate financial return to recoup their
And
investment.
they weren't building for the long term.
Not at all. They were highly aggressive, launching brutal slaving expeditions into the interior and alienating both the indigenous populations and the local Spaniards alike. They weren't interested in building sustainable settlements. By 1545, the chaos and complaints were so severe that Charles had to revoke the grant, ending this bizarre interlude of German colonization in the Spanish Main.
It really underscores how transactional and financially driven the empire's expansion was. And this reality of harsh environments dictating outcomes is extremely evident in North America. We have a string of initial failures. Ponce de Leon lands in Florida in 1513, but is killed in a later attempt to settle. Then there's the expedition of Pánfilo de Narvaez in 1527, which is an absolute disaster.
Oh, the Narvaez expedition is a prime example of Spanish vulnerability. They landed in Florida, marched inland, got lost, and were decimated by indigenous attacks and starvation.
They didn't know the terrain at all.
No, they tried to build rafts to sail to Mexico, and most drowned. Only 4 men survived, including Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca and an enslaved African man named Estevanico.
And their story is incredible.
It is. They spent years walking thousands of miles across the Gulf Coast and the Southwest, living among various indigenous groups as traders and healers, just trying to survive before finally reconnecting with Spanish forces in Mexico.
North America was incredibly frustrating for the Spanish. They kept hoping to find another Aztec or Inca empire.
They sent vast, well-funded expeditions under Hernando de Soto through the southeast and Francisco Vázquez de Coronado into the southwest. They found no dense, wealthy empires and no silver.
Just vast land.
Right. In 1559, Tristan de Luna y Arellano established a vast settlement with 1,500 people in Pensacola, Florida, but it was wiped out by a hurricane shortly after landing and eventually abandoned. It wasn't until 1565 that St. Augustine was successfully established in Florida.
And St. Augustine wasn't built for resource extraction, was it?
No, it was driven largely by the strategic need to protect the shipping lanes of the treasure fleets returning to Spain from French and English privateers. It was a military outpost, not an economic engine.
They also pushed into New Mexico under Juan de Oñate in 1598. But it was brutal. The environment was arid, the distances were vast. You mentioned the Spanish had to radically adapt on these frontiers.
Yeah.
Let's look at the Chichimeca in northern Mexico. How do they handle that conflict?
The Chichimeca War is highly illustrative of Spanish logistical limits. When the Spanish discovered huge silver deposits in northern Mexico, outside the zone of dense Mesoamerican populations, they had to secure the transport routes to get the silver back to Mexico City.
Makes sense.
But the nomadic and semi-nomadic Chichimeca fiercely defended their territory. They used bows and arrows with devastating accuracy and utilized the arid, rugged terrain to ambush Spanish supply trains.
So the Spanish waged a war to protect the roads.
They waged a brutal 50-year war, from roughly 1550 to 1600, attempting military subjugation. They built forts called presidios along the silver roads. It completely failed.
How did it fail?
The Chichimeca were highly mobile and simply bypassed the forts.
So how did the Spanish secure the silver routes if they couldn't win militarily?
Through a policy that came to be known as peace by purchase.
Peace by purchase.
Yes. The Spanish military finally realized they couldn't win by force. The cost of the war was eating into the profits of the silver. Instead, they opted to supply the Chichimeca with regular shipments of food, clothing, agricultural tools, and other commodities they demanded. They essentially bought a ceasefire.
They put the enemy on the payroll to protect the supply lines.
Yes. It was a pragmatic, economic solution to a military failure. By providing the Chichimeca with the goods they were raiding for, they ensured the lucrative silver trade could flow to Mexico City uninterrupted.
You mentioned earlier that the Mapuche and the Chichimeca adapted rapidly. This connects perfectly to the biological exchange between the old and new worlds, often called the Columbian Exchange, and the resulting demographic catastrophe. Because the biological exchange was just as consequential as the military campaigns.
Oh, absolutely.
The Spanish brought livestock, pigs, cattle, sheep, horses, and crops, like wheat, sugarcane, and citrus. In return, the Americas exported potatoes, maize, tomatoes, and chocolate, which completely transformed European diets and allowed for vast population growth there.
Yeah.
But looking at the Americas, the ecological transformation was severe.
The introduction of European livestock dramatically altered the landscape. In regions like the Argentine Pampas or northern Mexico, cattle multiplied at an astonishing rate, roaming largely feral. This created new economic opportunities for ranching in areas where traditional agriculture was difficult. However, the introduction of sheep was often an ecological disaster.
How so? I mean, sheep seem relatively harmless.
In areas of dense indigenous agriculture like central Mexico, the vast flocks of Spanish sheep ate the vegetation down to the roots. They destroyed indigenous crops. Furthermore, their grazing habits prevented native vegetation from regenerating, which contributed to severe soil erosion.
So it wasn't just displacing people, it was destroying the land's ability to feed people.
Right. This ecological degradation further undermined the indigenous food supply, compounding the demographic collapse.
Did the indigenous populations adapt to this new flora and fauna tactically? Because if you were fighting the Spanish, you noticed their primary advantage is cavalry. Did they start using horses?
They adapted brilliantly. While the Spanish initially tried to mandate that indigenous people could not own or ride horses, the animals quickly escaped into the wild or were captured during raids.
You can't put that genie back in the bottle.
Exactly. Indigenous groups on the frontiers, the Chichimeca in northern Mexico, the Comanche on the Great Plains, and the Mapuche in southern Chile mastered equestrianism in a matter of a few generations.
So they completely changed their military tactics.
They transitioned into highly mobile mounted warriors. The Mapuche even began conducting deep raids on horseback, capturing Spanish livestock and sometimes Spanish captives. The horse transformed the balance of power on the frontiers, turning these indigenous groups into formidable foes that halted further Spanish expansion for centuries.
But the most significant biological introduction wasn't livestock, it was disease. We touched on this with the Taino and the Incas, but the sheer scale of the demographic collapse across the hemisphere is difficult to comprehend. We were talking about a tragedy on a scale that reordered the human map.
The overwhelming cause of indigenous population decline was the introduction of infectious diseases to which they had no acquired immunity. We are talking about smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus. Because the populations of the Americas had been isolated from the Afro-Eurasian landmass for thousands of years, they lacked the antibodies to fight these pathogens.
What do the numbers look like?
The estimates are staggering. In Mexico, the pre-contact population fell by an estimated 90% by the early 17th century. In Peru, a population of perhaps 6.5 million dropped to around 1 million.
And the data from California presents a really crucial nuance to this timeline, right? Because we tend to think of this as a single event that happened right at contact.
Yes, the research of Sherburne F. Cook on California is vital to understanding the mechanics of this collapse. The Spanish began settling Alta California much later in 1769, setting up the mission system. Cook estimated the pre-contact indigenous population there at around 310,000. By 1910, it had collapsed to 25,000.
That is a staggering drop.
But Cook's data reveals something crucial. While European diseases and the harsh conditions of the Spanish mission system initiated the decline, the most dramatic collapse from roughly 200,000 down to 25,000 actually occurred after Spanish rule ended.
After the Spanish left.
Yes. The steepest decline happened during the Mexican period and later the United States period, specifically during the Gold Rush. This later collapse was driven by targeted violence, forced displacement, and starvation as miners and settlers encroached on indigenous lands.
So it wasn't just a biological accident.
No, it is a crucial reminder that the demographic catastrophe was an extended historical process lasting centuries, driven by changing policies and economic incentives, not just a single biological event in the 1500s.
The Spanish Empire now controls this vast transoceanic territory, dealing with indigenous demographic collapse, frontier wars, and immense distances. How do you govern a sprawling enterprise when communication takes months? I mean, a letter from Lima to Madrid could take a year-round trip. The Spanish crown managed this without any existing parliament or entrenched nobility in the Americas to check their power.
The crown's primary objective was to maximize resource extraction while simultaneously preventing the conquistadors and their descendants from forming an independent feudal aristocracy.
They remembered what happened in Peru.
Right. They had seen what happened when the encomenderos rebelled, and they were determined not to let the Americas become a collection of independent fiefdoms. To achieve this, they built a highly complex, overlapping, and intentionally decentralized bureaucracy.
It reminds me of a corporate structure designed specifically to ensure that no single regional manager can ever gain enough leverage to challenge the CEO. You have different departments reporting directly to the top, auditing each other and competing for favor.
That is the exact mechanism. At the top, residing in Spain, was the Council of the Indies, established in 1524. They drafted legislation, proposed appointments for all colonial officials, and acted as the Supreme Court for overseas matters. Alongside them was the Casa de Contratación, or House of Trade, founded in 1503 in Seville.
What did the House of Trade do?
The Casa controlled all physical movement across the Atlantic. They managed the shipping convoys, registered cargoes to prevent smuggling, collected the royal taxes, and crucially, they vetted immigrants.
Vetted them how?
They maintained strict background checks to ensure only those of old Christian heritage were allowed to travel to the Americas. They wanted to keep out anyone with Jewish or Muslim ancestry, as well as foreign nationals.
Then over in the Americas, you have the viceroyalties.
The viceroys were the direct representatives of the monarch, the vice-kings. Initially, there were only two. The Viceroyalty of New Spain, founded in 1535 and headquartered in Mexico City, overseeing North America, the Caribbean, and eventually the Philippines. And the Viceroyalty of Peru, founded in 1542, headquartered in Lima, responsible for South America.
Who got to be a viceroy?
The viceroys were almost exclusively high-ranking nobles born in Spain, appointed for fixed terms, usually 3 to 5 years. This was to ensure they didn't establish permanent local roots or build their own power bases.
But the viceroy didn't have absolute power. They were checked by the audiencias. What were they?
The audiencias were the high courts of the empire, but they possessed formidable executive and legislative powers alongside their judicial functions. The judges, or oidores, often served longer terms than the viceroys, providing administrative continuity. More importantly, the audiencias could communicate directly with the Council of the Indies and the king, bypassing the viceroy entirely.
So if a viceroy starts getting too ambitious, the court can just write to the king and complain.
Yes. This created a structural counterweight. It ensured that multiple officials were constantly reporting on each other, keeping ultimate power centralized in Madrid. Down at the local level, governance was handled by the cabildos, the town councils. This is where the American-born Spaniards, the criollos, really exercised their influence, controlling local land distribution and market regulations.
But what about the millions of indigenous people? How do they fit into this legal structure? Because you can't have a handful of Spanish bureaucrats managing every single village.
The Crown created a legal fiction of two separate administrative spheres. You had the República de Españoles and the República de Indios. The Spanish realized they couldn't govern millions of people directly. They needed intermediaries. So they systematically co-opted the surviving indigenous elites.
They recruited the local nobility to work for them.
Precisely. The Spanish recognized indigenous elites as nobles, granting them the right to use Spanish honorifics like Don and Doña. They were exempt from the head tax and could entail their lands. The Spanish essentially transformed the pre-existing indigenous city-states into Spanish-style municipalities, complete with their own indigenous cabildos.
What was the catch for the indigenous leaders?
The catch was that these indigenous leaders were now responsible for collecting tribute and organizing the rotary labor drafts from their own people to hand over to the Spanish authorities.
So they do the dirty work.
Right. As long as they delivered the wealth and maintained order, they retained their privileged status within their communities. They were caught in the middle, acting as a buffer between Spanish demands and indigenous survival.
It is a highly effective method of indirect rule. And the Crown even set up a specific legal apparatus for the indigenous population, right? The General Indian Court in Mexico.
The Juzgado General de Indios. It was a highly notable institution for its time. It heard disputes between indigenous individuals and, crucially, disputes between indigenous communities and Spanish colonizers over land and water rights.
Wait, so an indigenous village could sue a Spanish landowner?
Yes, and they frequently did. The legal representation for the indigenous plaintiffs was funded by a half-real tax paid by the indigenous population themselves.
So it was an early state-funded legal aid system.
Yes. Indigenous communities utilized the Spanish legal system extensively, bringing lawsuits against abusive encomenderos or encroaching Spanish ranchers. It was a pressure valve, allowing indigenous people to seek redress through the courts rather than through rebellion, which served the Crown's ultimate interest in maintaining stability and keeping the tribute flowing.
Speaking of maintaining stability and control, we have to look at the spiritual conquest and the casta system. The Catholic Church wasn't just a religious institution, it was a fundamental pillar of state administration. The relationship between the Spanish crown and the Pope is fascinating here, because the Pope doesn't seem to have much power in the Americas.
The relationship is defined by the Patronato Real, a papal grant issued in 1508 by Pope Julius II. This grant gave the Spanish monarchs, not the Pope, absolute authority over the administration of the Catholic Church in the Americas.
Why would the Pope give up that much power?
The papacy was focused on European politics and the growing threat of the Reformation. They didn't have the resources to fund a transoceanic missionary campaign, so they delegated it. The king had the power to appoint bishops, approve the establishment of new dioceses, collect tithes, and control the movements of all clerics.
So the king runs the church.
The Spanish monarch was the head of both the civil and the ecclesiastical hierarchies in the Americas. No papal bull could be published in the colonies without the king's approval.
The initial wave of this spiritual conquest was led by the mendicant religious orders. They're Franciscans, Dominicans, and Augustinians. They're the ones out on the frontiers building the missions.
In Mexico, Hernán Cortés specifically requested the friars, believing they were less corrupt than the secular clergy. The first major group was the 12 Apostles of Mexico, arriving in 1524. Among them was Toribio de Benavente, who famously adopted the Nahuatl name Motolinia, meaning the poor one, to connect with the indigenous populations who were suffering.
And what do they do?
These friars operated largely independently from the bishops, learning indigenous languages and focusing on rapid mass baptisms.
But the crown eventually decides they don't like these independent friars having so much control on the ground.
Once the core regions were largely pacified, the crown sought to assert tighter administrative control. Beginning around the 1550s, they systematically began replacing the regular orders of the friars with diocesan or secular clergy.
Who do they report to?
The secular clergy answered directly to the bishops, who in turn were appointed by the king. It was a move to integrate the church entirely into the royal bureaucracy and rein in the independent power of the orders.
I want to bring up the Inquisition because the way it operated in the Americas is pretty wild. We know about the Spanish Inquisition in Europe, rooting out hidden Jewish and Muslim populations. In the Americas, the early ecclesiastical authorities also functioned as inquisitors. There is a specific historical vignette that illustrates how this functioned and why it changed.
You are referring to the case of Don Carlos of Texcoco in 1539. Bishop Juan de Zumárraga, acting with inquisitorial powers, prosecuted and executed Don Carlos. He was an indigenous Nahuatl lord who had converted to Christianity but allegedly renounced it and urged his followers to return to their ancestral gods.
But Zumárraga got in trouble for doing that, didn't he?
He was severely reprimanded by the crown. The execution was viewed as a dangerous political error. The crown realized that prosecuting high-ranking indigenous nobles for apostasy could spark widespread, uncontrollable rebellion.
Too much of a risk.
Exactly. Consequently, when the formal Holy Office of the Inquisition was established in Mexico and Lima in 1571, indigenous peoples were explicitly excluded from its jurisdiction.
How did they legally justify excluding them?
The legal reasoning was that indigenous people were neophytes, new converts, and therefore not fully capable of understanding complex theological doctrine. Because of this supposed ignorance, they could not be prosecuted for formal heresy.
So what did the Inquisition actually do in the Americas?
Instead, the Inquisition focused heavily on controlling the morals of the Spanish population, rooting out Protestant smugglers, investigating witchcraft and bigamy, and policing the casta system.
Let's touch on that casta system. Society was rigidly structured by race and origin, attempting to categorize a highly complex demographic reality.
The demographic reality was messy, and the state tried to legally define it. You had the Peninsulares, Spaniards born in Spain, who held the highest royal and ecclesiastical offices. Below them were the Criollos, Spaniards born in the Americas, who dominated local government and the economy but were systematically blocked from top administrative positions.
And as the populations mixed?
As the Spanish, indigenous, and African populations intermixed over generations, a vast, complex casta system emerged to categorize people based on their heritage, which dictated their tax burdens and legal rights.
Mestizos, for example, the children of Spanish and indigenous parents.
Yes. And there were also significant populations of free and enslaved Africans. Unlike in some other colonial systems, enslaved Africans in Spanish America had legal avenues to purchase their freedom, a practice called coartation.
How did that work?
They could save money and legally demand that a judge set a price for their freedom. Because of this, in many parts of the empire, the free black and mulatto populations eventually outnumbered the enslaved populations, forming crucial artisanal and militia classes in the cities.
All of this society, the bureaucracy, the church, the frontier wars, the fleets, was funded by one thing. We moved to the engine of global wealth. Gold was the initial draw, But silver was the true foundation of the empire.
Silver was the bonanza that altered the global economy. The Spanish discovered phenomenal deposits. In northern Mexico, you had the mines of Zacatecas and Guanajuato. But the crown jewel was in the Viceroyalty of Peru, in present-day Bolivia, the Cerro Rico de Potosi. It was a literal mountain of silver located at an altitude of over 13,000 feet.
But extracting silver is a heavy industrial process. You can't just pick it up off the ground like a nugget in a stream. How did they mobilize the labor for Potosi in such a harsh environment?
They utilized the indigenous structures they had co-opted. In the 1570s, Viceroy Francisco de Toledo instituted sweeping reforms. He revived and expanded the Inca Mita system.
Remind us what that is.
Under the Incas, the Mita was a rotary labor tax where communities provided labor for public works or state agriculture. Toledo perverted this system, forcing indigenous communities across the Andes to send quotas of men to perform grueling, highly dangerous labor in the deep freezing shafts of Potosi for a fraction of a free market wage.
Let me stop you there because digging the ore is only step one. The actual physical process of refining the silver, separating the pure metal from the rock, seems incredibly toxic. How did they do it on a mass scale?
It was an industrial nightmare. They developed a method called the patio process. The raw ore brought up from the mines was crushed by mule-driven mills into a fine powder. This powder was then spread out in large open-air courtyards or patios. It was then mixed with salt, water, and crucially, mercury.
Mercury is a severe neurotoxin. How do they mix it?
Indigenous workers and mules had to wade through this toxic sludge, treading it with their bare feet and hooves for weeks to facilitate the chemical amalgamation where the mercury binds to the silver dust.
So they are barefoot, knee-deep in cold mercury mud at 13,000 feet.
And it caused immense suffering. Workers suffered from acute mercury poisoning, neurological damage, severe tremors, tooth loss, madness, and premature death. Furthermore, mercury was a strict royal monopoly. The crown controlled the supply from the Almaden mine in Spain and the Huancavelica mine in Peru.
Why monopolize the mercury?
Because by controlling the exact amount of mercury sold to the refiners, the crown could accurately calculate mathematically how much pure silver was being produced. This ensured they received their required tax, the quinto real or royal fifth, preventing the miners from hiding their profits. The ecological damage from mercury runoff in places like Huancavelica continues to impact the environment and local health today.
To feed these sweeping mining hubs, the economy had to diversify. You can't eat silver, and tens of thousands of people are living in Potosi.
Exactly. Large-scale agricultural estates, known as haciendas, developed specifically to supply the mining towns with wheat, maize, leather, and meat. Potosi became one of the largest cities in the world, requiring vast supply chains. Alongside domestic agriculture, the Spanish developed highly lucrative export crops.
Like sugar.
Yes. Cane sugar, grown in the Caribbean and coastal areas of South America, became a colossal industry. The brutal labor demands of sugar harvesting drove the horrific expansion of the transatlantic slave trade to import enslaved African labor as the indigenous populations plummeted.
They also exported indigenous products that Europe developed a taste for. Cacao, for chocolate, obviously, and cochineal.
Cochineal is fascinating. It is a brilliant, color-fast red dye produced from crushing dried scale insects that live on nopal cacti, primarily cultivated in Oaxaca, Mexico.
And it was valuable.
It became incredibly highly prized in Europe for dyeing textiles, royal garments, and cosmetics. It eventually became the second most valuable export from Spanish America, right after silver.
The wealth was staggering, but empires have a life cycle. That brings us to the setting sun, the era of reforms and independence. In the 18th century, the Habsburg dynasty ends, and the Bourbon monarchy takes over, beginning with Philip V. They look at the empire and decide it is too decentralized, too inefficient, and too controlled by local American elites. They initiate the Bourbon reforms.
The Bourbon reforms were an attempt at a top-down revolution in government. The crown sought to rationalize administration, increase tax revenues to fund their European wars, and build a standing military to defend against British and French incursions. They replaced the old system of corregidors with newly appointed salaried officials called intendants who reported directly to the crown and were tasked with tightening tax collection.
They also went after the Catholic Church, didn't they?
They specifically targeted the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. The Jesuits had become incredibly powerful. They ran vast, highly profitable estates, controlled education, and operated independent missions on the frontiers, particularly in Paraguay, which essentially functioned as autonomous republics.
So they were a threat to royal power.
They resisted royal control. In 1767, the Bourbon crown abruptly expelled the Jesuits from Spain and all its overseas territories, seizing their immense assets and causing widespread disruption.
But the most consequential reform was political. The Bourbons systematically began replacing American-born Criollos in the audiencias and high administrative posts with peninsulares shipped over directly from Spain. They were tightening their grip. But history shows us that tightening the grip often causes the subject to slip through the fingers.
The alienation of the Criollo elite was the fatal flaw of the Bourbon reforms. For over a century, the Criollos had viewed themselves as loyal Spanish subjects who managed the empire locally. Suddenly, they were treated as second-class citizens, untrustworthy, and sidelined in their own homelands. This resentment simmered for decades, laying the ideological groundwork for revolution.
But they needed a spark. And the spark that sets off the powder keg actually comes from Europe.
The trigger was the Napoleonic Peninsular War. In 1808, Napoleon invaded Spain, captured the Bourbon king Ferdinand VII, and placed his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the Spanish throne. The Spanish Empire was suddenly without a legitimate head. In response, local assemblies, or juntas, formed in Spain and across the Americas, claiming to rule in the name of the captive king.
But once you create local self-governance, it is very hard to put the genie back in the bottle when the king eventually returns.
Precisely. What began as a legalistic assertion of loyalty to the deposed king rapidly evolved into a movement for outright independence. When Ferdinand VII returned to the throne and attempted to crush the juntas and restore absolute rule, it radicalized the aggrieved Criollo elites of the Libertadores like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín.
The timeline of the collapse is rapid once it starts. The first declarations occur in Upper Peru, present-day Bolivia, at Charcas and La Paz in 1809. Mexico declares independence in 1810, triggering a brutal, chaotic, decade-long war that is finally formalized by the Treaty of Córdoba in 1821. By the 1820s, almost the entire mainland is broken away. The sun finally sets on the Spanish Empire in the Americas in 1898, when they lose Cuba and Puerto Rico to the United States following the Spanish-American War.
It brings us to a final, thought-provoking paradox to ponder. We look at the military conquests of Cortés and Pizarro, which were incredibly swift. But the true longevity of the Spanish Empire, lasting over 3 centuries, relied heavily on an unintentional reality. In their pursuit of efficient resource extraction, the Spanish chose to preserve and co-opt indigenous structures of tribute, local nobility, and communal land rights.
By trying to extract wealth as smoothly as possible, they needed those existing structures.
That is right. By doing so, the Spanish Empire inadvertently ensured that indigenous languages, political structures, and deep community identities survived underneath a bureaucratic surface. They didn't erase the pre-Columbian world, they layered their empire on top of it. And it is those surviving indigenous structures, altered but enduring, that continue to fundamentally shape the political, demographic, and cultural reality of modern Latin America today.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.